everyone, and thank you for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. You would do us a real big favour if you pressed subscribe or shared it around with your friends. Joining us again today is Dr. Stephen Mackinson, Chief of Science at the SPFA, that's the Scottish Pelagic Fishermen's Association. Hello, Steve, and welcome back to Seafood Matters.
Oh, Jim, thanks for having me back. I appreciate that. It's good to be back.
Thank you. It's great to have you back. When we talk about pelagic species, people tend to treat them as one group scientifically. What's the most important distinction we should be making between them?
You start with a good question there. They're always good questions, Jim. When we talk about pelagic species, so pelagic refers to fish that swim in the pelagic zone. It's sort of the middle of the water column, so not the surface, not the bottom, but kind of everything in between. And pelagic species tend to swim there, but actually many of them can spend a fair bit of time closer to the bottom than to the middle, as it were. So they're not sort of demersal, but they like to hang out there, like herring, for instance. They're often found down there. One of the key rather than a distinguishing feature, a key characteristic of pelagic fish is shoaling behavior, and shoaling is like big aggregations of fish together. But pelagic fish go sort of one step further than shoaling, and that's they have coordinated, organized behavior within a shoal, and that's schooling behavior. So often, referred to schools or marks when fishermen see them on their things. And I suppose again a typical characteristic is that they kind of sit in the middle of the food web, eating plankton, transferring energy from the lower trophic levels up to higher trophic levels. Examples, I mean, there's lots of examples. We often hear a distinction between small pelagic fish and large pelagic fish. So that's a good one to think about. Small ones, herring, sardines, sprat, anchovies, arguably mackerel, horse mackerel, smelt, capelin, blue whiting, boarfish, those little orange spiky things. And then you've got your large ones, obvious ones, tuna, swordfish, stuff like that. So one of the big distinctions would be small and large, and the larger ones being sort of top predators, and the small ones being food for things like tuna and swordfish. Other distinguishing features. So even if you just took like the small ones, there's a huge variety of differences around things like differences in growth rate, life history, migration patterns, spawning behavior, feeding. So it's easy to lump them into a category, but there's a heck of a lot of differences too.
One of the things I would always add to that, and correct me, or you can explain it, I would always distinguish them as being oily fish.
Yeah, that's a good one. So yeah, you're right. They look different. I forgot that one as a key distinguishing feature. At least for those who know fish, a herring doesn't look like a mackerel, so they're oily. They look different. They taste different. Of course, they have a very different value in the market. Many of them, not all of them, are oily. So they're rich in omega 3s in particular. So they have high nutritional value as well.
Yeah. I don't know, do you enjoy eating them yourself?
I do, I love fresh mackerel in particular, but it's hard to get fresh mackerel. I mean, really fresh mackerel. It's hard to beat. I like a bit of herring, but they're too bony for me. I like the taste of them. They're probably the main ones. And sardines, actually, we've just got some really nice Cornish sardines popped up in our local Morrisons, and I probably know the guys who are catching them, and they're really good value and super fresh. So they're nice on the grill as well.
From what I hear about the fishery down there with that, what an amazing taking that whoever it was who started that off, and that was just amazing because I think
Yeah.
it's a very important fishery for them now, is it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I was really pleased to see them in our local store. Yeah.
Yeah, we have them up here as well, and I buy them here. Where do the old dynamics really diverge?
Um, I mean, I don't deal much with anything the large pelagic, so I guess my answer is going to focus around the small pelagics and the big one. I think it's really kind of like the life history and growth. So if you take something like a sprat, that's a good starting example. A sprat's life history is kind of live fast and die young. So so they're smaller, they grow quickly. They'll live, I don't know, is it maybe 4 or 5 years? But by the age of sort of uh, two, they're quickly, they're 1 or 2, they're mature. Um, so they have a hard, short, fast life, and then you've got things that don't get much bigger than a sprat. Something like a boarfish, but boarfish live slow and die old. They can last until they're 40, 50 years old. They're incredibly old fish, and and interestingly, similarly, if you look at mackerel, the maximum age of a mackerel is 20. You won't find many 20-year-old mackerel about, but you'll find enough sort of 12 to 15-year-olds. But horse mackerel, interestingly, they routinely sort of can go up to like 35 years old, and you'd think a horse mackerel being a similar, you just think it'd be similar to a regular mackerel, but not at all. They're quite prehistoric, the horse mackerel, and they live old. Yeah.
I listen. I obviously speak to a lot of whitefish boats, more so obviously up around Scrabster and that. And a lot of them have a real problem in certain areas with the boarfish.
Yeah.
Are they a big shoaling fish?
Yes, over the last few years, boarfish has really the population of boarfish has grown quite immensely and spread out over a wide area. So it's had a bit of a boom. Um, Historically, what happened was when the boarfish fishery started, it was sort of discovered, and nobody really knew the size or the state of the stock, and it got heavily fished as boats were trying to build up track record on in the fishery. And what nobody realized at that time is that fishing boarfish like that was effectively like mining. It was a big stock that didn't replace itself, as I just mentioned, quickly because it lives old. So you were just mining out a lot of old old fish, and it collapsed quite quickly. So the track record built up, the fishery grew, and it collapsed. And it's been low for a long time, and then recently it's just sort of really taken off, and it's probably on the back of 1 or 2 good recruitments. I don't know the detail, and I know there's a lot of work actually been done that quite recently, but and it's just boomed. So I think a couple of good recruitments or something, and the population's rocketed. Whether it'll uh, be around to last because they don't reach sexual maturity for quite an age. So.
Okay. If I could just go back to our conversation a few minutes ago when you were saying that you're not so keen on herring, now with it being so bony, I take it that goes for kippers as well, does it?
Yeah, yeah. I eat most of my herring, and I do really like it there. When I'm in Denmark, all of the sort of cured
Oh,
versions that they have, and they're just fabulous. They just
yeah.
really know how to
Oh,
prepare it, and that's where I like it. Yeah, but
I
kippers and things there.
yeah, I love the Scandinavian cuisine. I love their bridges and I just love their pickles.
Yeah, so I'll eat it there and then feel guilty I'm not eating it here.
Well, here's a compromise for you. I'm not making it. It's not about me or that, but I had a seafood restaurant up in Scrabster for just the best part of 20 years. And one of the biggest finds I ever had, and it's honestly outstanding, is A kipper, obviously, as we know, it's a herring and it's cold smoked. It's a form of smoking. It's kippering. You get somebody. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people down there. You get somebody to kipper mackerel,
Yeah.
and
We used to have a smokehouse in town, and the chimney's still there, and it's a. I wish he was still here, but he's moved on. But there's a good place in Lowestoft that doesn't mean smoking. So,
well,
no.
kippered mackerel. I used it a lot when I had the restaurant, and just grill it. Then just get it smoked like a kipper, and then just grill it like a kipper. Nothing fancy, nothing chefy, and
Really?
even making like you would make a kipper patty. Well, I would make a kippered mackerel patty, and it's just fantastic.
Okay, you're making me hungry.
Well, it's a strong recommendation.
Well, it sounds like a good one, built from years of experience.
It's just fantastic, and like a lot of funny how a lot of things, it's certainly in restaurant chefs and that a lot of their best dishes come from mistakes.
Yeah.
They've maybe done something wrong and they'll say, oh, no, well, a minute now. That's not so bad. But I couldn't recommend that highly enough, honestly, Steve. Kippered mackerel and
Brilliant.
anything you want with it, patty or as it is grilled, just fantastic. And you don't have the bones problem as you do with herring.
Yeah, sounds good.
Which pelagic species do you think is least well understood at the moment, and why?
Um, we just talked about boarfish, and that really is an interesting one because of the way the fishery grew, and nobody realised it was that old. And like I said, there's been a lot of work recently from the Marine Institute in Ireland, and together with some of the Irish industry, trying to improve the information going to stock assessment. But that's, I'd say, been neglected for quite some time. Maybe it's not so much which species or which aspects of which species, sort of like the life history. So it's the stages that sometimes, you know a lot a bit about one stage in their life cycle because you can see them, you can sample them and things, but it's the bits that you can't get access to. So excuse me, the young fish, or where they're hiding in places that you can't get access to them, and that's critical, obviously, for things like stock assessment. So sometimes it's about the stages and the processes in the life rather than the species itself.
And is boarfish marketable? Is it got a market?
I think it's probably being used for reduction, yeah, to meal. I should
Oh, okay.
imagine
Yeah, yeah.
they're spiky little devils. I
Uh-huh.
think there'd be quite a job. You need a decent sized one to get any fillet off one. I think you can get a fillet off one, but it's a tough it's a tough job to do it because you just
Okay.
don't get the yield off the majority of the size of the fish. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, well, that'll be a good challenge for somebody to come up with a market and a dish for them. Pelagic stocks are always been cyclical. How well does modern science separate natural variability from fishing-driven change?
That's a very good question. They always are. That's what modern science tries to do in both. So I'm going to kind of split science, if you like, fishery science, into two components here. One is research and understanding. So that's really trying to understand things like these cycles of change and what drives them. And then at the sharp end of the system, if you like, is trying to take that knowledge and apply that understanding into things like stock assessments that affect predictions of total allowable catches, that affect obviously management, sustainability of stocks. So there's a huge effort basically into understanding, cycling of stocks and how much of that is affected by fishing, systematic climate change, variability in, interannual, between year variability in weather and water conditions. So how much of that kind of change from the environment is just sort of noise from year to year, or it's systematic in the sense that it's going in a direction? And then how much of the fishing and any bycatches and things affect the population as well? And it's the job then of stock assessments to try and build that in to predictions of what future stocks might be. And that's generally done through in what we call a stock recruitment relationship. Also, how much recruits will you get into the future, giving a stock level, but by also adding into that those calculations consideration of changes in the productivity regimes. So how productive it is over a period given known changes. It for the most part, it's quite unsatisfying, I would say, because it's exceptionally difficult to find those relationships in the first place. So you know that there should be relationships, and it matters, but actually having clarity on what those drivers are is never that easy.
Okay. Recruitment still seems to sit at the heart of uncertainty to a degree. What do we genuinely understand about why some year classes succeed and others don't?
Again, um, the Achilles heel of fisheries science recruitment, and age-old questions for biologists starting, back in the late 1800s, looking at, eggs and the development and trying to understand their survival through to fish, small fish, and then what pressure they have through predation on them. So, that variability is, so from a research point of view, it's covered through surveys, trying to detect fish at different early life stages, estimate those abundance, use models to try and predict things like drift patterns and death rates. Um, but we've got a handle on the sense that for some species, like haddock's a good one. It's we know it's a sporadic spawner, so you have many years of poor year classes, then you have one huge successful recruitment, and that will carry then through into the fishery for a long period of time. But deciphering the exact conditions that led to that are still somewhat of a mystery, because if you could predict it, if you could see that coming the year before, you'd go, "Hey, we know what's coming. This is good, and we can plan for it." And that's really, yeah. Yeah, so I think we can identify in different species the patterns, but we're just still far short of decent explanations. Uh,
Uh-huh. So is recruitment still the weakest link in pelagic assessments?
yeah, in my mind, definitely.
Okay, right. Pelagic fish don't sit still long enough to be measured neatly. What are the biggest blind spots in how we survey them?
We're just going back, I think, to the thing I mentioned about how there's not one weakness in a pelagic species. Maybe about in terms of knowledge gaps, it's more about the particular life stages. So biggest blind gaps are being able, blind spots in surveying are being able to see all the ages, so you can get a good representation of the age composition of the stock. Because um, what we're effectively trying to do, of course, is reconstruct what the population looks like and how it progresses over time as things grow and as things die. Um, so if you can only see pieces of that picture because the surveying doesn't allow you, let's say, access. Let's say some of the fish live in close inshore areas for a certain time of their life, so they're either inaccessible to the kind of survey boats, or they're inaccessible to the tools that are being used to survey. Then you have poor quality information. I mean, for instance, We all know that trawls are very selective. Trawls are a survey tool that's used to go and catch fish and estimate catch rates. But they're very selective. So where they're used, how they're used, when they're used, and the sizes of the mesh and all sorts of things. So blind spots come from the tools we use. Acoustics, for instance, pelagic fish, fishermen, it's their it's their absolute key tool, echo sounders and sonars for detecting and then directing their fishing operations. But from a surveying point of view, um, the Achilles heel there again is the fact that you can be fooled by what you're looking at. You get some nice marks on the screen, there's some fish underneath you, but we have to identify them and we have to catch them to identify them for sure. I mean, some things look different, you can separate with some confidence things like herring and mackerel from one another because they mark differently at different frequencies because of the um, presence or absence of a swim bladder. Sand eels are also a bit easier to separate. But you can come up against something like a herring school adjacent to a horse mackerel school, and they can be behaving very similarly near the bottom and have a very similar registration on the echo sounder, and you could easily misclassify them. Sprat sometimes and herring mix together and make it exceptionally difficult to separate them. If the sprat are sitting up near the surface, you can separate them by behavior. So the blind spots are not just about the aspects of life history that make them difficult to see, but also the tools that we've got. That you do the best with the tools that you've got. Um, genetic composition of stocks, that's a blind spot. Um, uh, we know that fish stocks are made of components of different populations fish populations are made of different components of regional stocks, if you like, and some of those stocks may be more vulnerable or sensitive than others, but you can't make that distinction easily.
Okay. Steve, tell me if I've picked this up right. I'm of the mind that I have. But I was in a conversation with fishermen one day, a while back, and there were pelagic boats fishing round about North Rona, that's northwest of the mainland, and they reckoned that the shoal, mackerel it was, the shoal they reckoned was over 50 mile wide, and they couldn't tow right through it, or they would say they would lose their net and possibly their boat. So they were just dipping into the shoal and back out again at the edge. And then after they were fishing there for a while, and then all of a sudden they moved. And the next day they got that shoal in the west of Ireland.
Yeah. Yeah.
But does that all make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's a pattern that generally, well, two sides to it. The timing side, the sort of sitting around and waiting and then hightailing it down to Ireland is a pattern that's repeatable every year. The behavior of them sitting in a massive school and that period of time, they were referring it to the super school, and I remember, I've spoken to people about that too. And actually, this year there were some echoes of a similar very, very, very large schools during the autumn fishery that go for up to 10 miles long and 100 meters deep, and who knows how wide. Where boats were having to just fish on the edge again for risk of just getting too much too quickly. But the timing wise, it's sort of a repeatable feature in the sense that the fish are coming down from Norway and through wherever they come through during autumn, winter, and they're ending up sort of normally or typically, on the west side of Shetland before sort of sitting around in that January, February period or January. And then the belief is a sort of a critical, and they just sit there, overwintering, we call it. Um, and being in large schools at that time when you're overwintering affords you protection from predators. So that's mainly the thing. If you're not actively feeding, your your number one objective in life is not to die. So if it's not food and it's not sex, then it's don't get eaten. And super schools, of course, allow you to do that. They help from that predator protection point of view. But then there's a trigger where they just hightail it off and start to move really quickly down the west coast on the shelf edge, or just, well, actually on the shelf, all the way down to Ireland, maybe as far some as the Bay of Biscay, and it's that spawning migration, and it's believed to be a critical water temperature that hits around that time that trips it off effectively. But when they go, then they all just start to go. Um, and then they'll go down, and then in sort of early March you start spawning, and they spawn all the way along that along the shelf edge there, all the way up still to the Hebrides area.
It's fascinating. The predator-prey relationship gets talked about a lot in pelagic debates. How well do we actually understand them?
Well, when it comes to pelagics, right? So predator prey for pelagics, that the easy part, or the easier part of that understanding, is when a pelagic fish is a prey item for something bigger. Because when a bigger fish eats smaller fish, normally you can detect it in the stomach, whether it's scales, otoliths, or whatever's left in the stomach. You can see it. So the pelagic fish as prey of other fish or other animals, for instance, is something that is probably much better understood, and well, I say when I say understood, I mean quantified, than the actual prey of pelagic fish, because pelagic fish will eat predominantly, well, lots of things. They will eat. So let's go down to a herring. Start with a herring, for instance. They'll eat zooplankton, which are the little animals that eat phytoplankton, the cellular plants in the sea, and that's their predominant food source. But different pelagic fish will perhaps select different types of prey sizes of the zooplankton. So that can be nuanced right there. They'll eat fish eggs and stuff like that as well, including each other's if they're around. And they probably eat some small fish larvae and other larvae and things. But then if you step it up a bit, things like mackerel and horse mackerel, they'll eat a large portion of. Actually, just one thing I'd forgot to mention there. Those things that they have in their stomach, no, are really difficult to identify at times, because they just end up as a mushy soup in the stomach. So whereas when fish are prey of other things, you can detect them. Quantifying what's just a soup of plankton, mushy plankton in a herring's belly is not so straightforward, and it gets processed and digested quickly. If you move up to a mackerel or a horse mackerel or something, they eat a lot of plankton too, but they also eat a lot of small fish. And I've gutted a horse mackerel that have got small normal mackerel in up to sort of 10 centimeters and stuff like, and several of them. So they're quite a voracious predator of each other. Things like mackerel. Yeah.
I remember a day it was in Scrabster Harbour, and some people reckon that there was the mackerel, and they quite often, I mean, a lot of people fish around the quays, the piers and round Scrabster Harbour for mackerel. So they're in quite a bit. But there was one day there a couple of years back, maybe not the only day, but there was a shoal of mackerel in the middle of the harbour, and the gannets were diving on them. And it was just standing in the pier, like looking live at a National Geographic program. And inside the harbour, there's a ramp where fishermen would run their small, when the tide was up, they would take their small boat over it and then wait till the tide was out so that they could work on the hull and keel and that on them. And this ramp, there was small fish. We would have said they were almost like a sand dealer sprat type. And the mackerel were just ferocious. They were just coming up the ramp, chasing them up the ramp, out of the water.
Yeah. So can you imagine that state when you've got thousands and thousands and thousands, well, millions of mackerel in the sea, and the amount they must consume? It's quite unbelievable to think about that, and that's what ecosystem models and things try and do: quantify that on the basis of what they find in the stomachs of fish, and they try and work that up.
Does management properly account for that dual role if they're predator, if they're a major predator and a major prey?
Yeah, it does, but implicitly. Maybe I'll just explain a little bit. So, a fundamental principle or fundamental element of a stock assessment model or anything is basically you're trying to reconstruct a population, and what you need to know is then um, how many births there are, uh, how much the things that there will grow from one year to the next, and then and how much dies, and that's basically a population growth model. But if you break the death component down, we've got things that die. Excuse me. A fraction of those deaths are due to fishing, so that's it. And the other fraction is due to either they're getting eaten or they're dying of other natural causes, disease or old age. I don't think many fish die of old age. They're dead before that in other ways. They get eaten, etc. So, and we separate those. So it actually, the terminology is that in models you'll see this symbol or letter Z. So Z is everything, is all of the mortality, everything, all of the death. And then we have this F, which is fishing mortality, and M, which is natural mortality. So often you'll see fishing mortality, FMSY or something like that. So you see this letter F, and that stands for fishing mortality. So it's the component of the mortality that is due to fishing. So management does take that into account. So a key part of the models is trying to models spend their time trying to partition or explain how much of the total death is due to fishing and due to natural mortality. So yeah, it does. And if you have, for instance, let's say a stock assessment of a herring, there'll be a term in there for natural mortality, and that will explain how much of the herring are lost from the population due to being eaten and other causes of death. What it doesn't explain is all of the. It doesn't have the mortality. It doesn't have the sort of the bits about. Well, you just have growth rate. It doesn't tell you then for or the predation that a herring or a mackerel might have on other species. And the reason is because that predation effect it has on other species is effectively incorporated in the assessment of the other species as death. So it's the predation from one side, it becomes the death in another assessment. So of course that only refers then to other things that you have an assessment for that has a death rate. And fish eat lots of different things that we don't know about. So we don't often know the impacts of predation and all the things that we don't assess in any other way.
See, pelagic fisheries are often linked to seabird and marine mammal declines. Just when you were saying that about other species, I thought about the birds as well. How strong is the evidence for direct cause and effect?
Yeah, I'm no expert on this. I mean, I've got one good example, which is I think it's really clear and it's been published and demonstrated, and that would be sand eel, but not sand eel everywhere. So sand eel near is it the Farne Islands? I think Farne. I've forgotten the area. There's a closed area because of the cause and effect between sand eels and the seabirds in the area, and kittiwake in particular. And a fellow called Bob Furness has published lots of information. He's a seabird expert, and he's shown that to be the case. But that's a strong cause and effect for two reasons. The sand eels have strong site fidelity to the sand that they need to bury in, so they can't go a long way from that area. So they're really tied to that spot. And then the birds only have a certain range that they can leave from their from the coast and fly out to forage. And it just so happens that these sand eel areas are within that reach, if you like, so they can go to those areas. So that would be the area that they would forage on. So there's a strong connection between both of them basically having a limitation on their either range or their fidelity to a particular area. So the dependency is quite tight. And when the sand eels declined in that area, it directly affected the breeding success of the seabirds. So I think there is evidence. I think it's hard again in so much of science to connect those dots where things are highly mobile and less connected. So they might be connected at certain moments. Like you mentioned the gannets diving in on the mackerel. You can't go down there every day and see that at the same time or the same place. So detecting those kind of events and the linkages is really hard to do. It has to be monitored well and over time. So when things are highly mobile, I think it becomes difficult to do that. But we know that there's obvious connections. I guess the other one is where species are really highly specialized in their diet, and I can't think of any examples that quickly come to mind. But in nature, some animals have such a specialized way of foraging. Let's say anteaters. Let's move out of the marine realm. That they've evolved or designed, to eat that way. So they become very specialized, and that means they're just, dependent and linked directly to their prey. In the marine environment, for the most case, what we see, and I've done work on this, is that fish predators generally are what we call generalists. What they're trying to do is get some food, and they'll eat whatever's available if it fits in their mouth effectively. Something that's a third to half of their body length is a typical rule, but they'll eat anything. So they're not saying, oh, sand eels or herring aren't on the menu, therefore I'm going to go hungry. They'll just say, well, I'll eat something else.
What's your views? And a previous podcaster, he's retired now. You might know, I don't know if you've ever worked with him. He's quite a bit retired now. Dave Mackay, his name is, and he worked with it was Marine Scotland then, in the Marine Lab. And his theory, Steve, was the birds, and he was probably, maybe in fairness, having a go at the environmentalists, because what annoyed him was they linked everything to overfishing. And he felt that it was almost the opposite, because his theory was that when mesh size, this is more probably whitefish, as mesh size increases, there's more fish escaping. So he says there's more small fish in the sea, and one of their biggest diets is sand eels. And he says that's an important diet for a lot of the wader birds and things like that. And he reckoned that a fish is more efficient than a bird. So the bird's not, one of the reasons the seabirds are not getting sand eels is because through trying to conserve stocks, there's more actual fish escaping and there's more fish eating sand eels.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, and that's a typical predator-prey, interaction. It's like, I I I know there's some evidence for it, and I've certainly done some studies on predator-prey modeling work, and we see that with the North Sea cod stock going down, it was kinda clear at the time that, it's basically what we call predation release. The nephrops stocks, were being released from that. They just weren't being hit so hard by cod, which likes the nephrops. And and lo and behold, around that time, then the nephrop stock started doing really well, bec because maybe you had that predation released from the cod. So that's the real challenge. They are massive challenges. There's so much food web modeling work which is highly sophisticated and very good, um, but bringing it into the applied management arena rather than just the research arena and the explanations is really difficult. Um, yeah, and it's not, it's sort of constantly on the agenda and has been for the last 30 years or more. Um, but it's not an easy job to do that. So there's a lot known, but I'd say not so much applied.
Uh-huh. When we're seeing increases in some predators, we were seeing bigger predators earlier, and then we include maybe seals and certain whale species. How does that change predator-prey balance for pelagic fish, even some whitefish?
Yeah, I think again, it depends on who's eating who and how much, right? So I know when I've been doing survey work in the mints there, we've seen loads of porpoises at a time when there were sprat schools everywhere near the surface, and I'm absolutely certain those porpoises were working sprat schools, and so and the birds too. Um, but uh, seals, not so much. I think the seal diet studies, I think they tend to be more targeting ground fish than pelagic fish. They like flatfish too. Um, so I don't think seals are so much of a concern for pelagic fish, other than, of course, when you get smart seals, and that's the thing about marine mammals. They're smart. If they can find an easy meal, they will do so. They'll attack lines and stuff like that, and follow boats, or even go into nets while they're being towed. You've probably seen videos like that
Yeah,
online.
the,
They
the
just
catch cam.
hang on to the head rope and dive in for a snack.
There's
So
one that Tom Rossiter and Ian Whiteman did in the
he's got one,
Clyde,
has he?
and
Yeah,
the seal went right into the net, had its
yeah,
meal, and swam back out again.
yeah, yeah. So for certain that because they just adapt very quickly to where the easy meal is. You get that situation. But for many of the pelagic fish, I think that we've got just to comment on mackerel. There's a huge population of killer whales that follow the mackerel fishing fleet now, both in autumn and the winter fishery. And most of the vessels, I just see them almost every haul, and sometimes 10, sometimes 50, sometimes more than 100, and it's quite phenomenal. So you've got a, a species of whale there, killer whales in particular, that are again very smart, and they're just following the fishery that's ringing the dinner bell. They always just hold off and wait and pick up the stray snacks, as it were, on the way. They never sort of have, never get caught, have any sorts of negative interactions, because 'cause they're just too smart to do that. Um, but I'm sure they're thriving because of in many ways, because of the fishery. It's an easy meal. Same with discards and birds, right? The discard ban came in, and all of the modeling projections and stuff that I was doing at the time for DEFRA showed that the implication of the discard ban was going to be declines in bird populations because the free dinner was over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, the other one thing I wanted to ask you, I suppose it does come into predator prey, but not to the same degree. They're not a situation we get up, certainly up north here, and it's referred to, fishermen refer it as spawny haddocks. Now, that would be fish that would be just gorging on herring spawn. And we used to I very clearly remember that when there was a lot of boats fishing out to Kinlochbervie, there'd be a certain time of the year and they would start getting, as we called it, spawny haddocks. And the boats fishing around Orkney, Scrabster, out to Scrabster, and that just a bit further east, they would be saying to themselves, well, that's a good sign if the Kinlochbervie boats are getting them within 2 to 3 weeks, we'll get them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And is that would be after they've spawned and moved on?
Yeah, I think so. I never had the pleasure of sort of catching any spawny haddocks, but when we were doing we did from 2016 to 2021 the pelagic boats. We were running some surveys during the autumn of herring on the west coast from sort of Cape Wrath and down. It was still above Cape Wrath as well. But when we were surveying those areas, we had maps of spawny haddock catch maps that were directing some of those areas where we were looking for spawning areas of herring. So yeah, that connection is the haddock coming in to eat the spawn when it's been laid on the seabed and stuck to the seabed afterwards. But the other thing that connects with herring and spawning is spur dog. So the old dogfish spur dogs, they like to munch down on a herring when it's spawning, and I think that's a bit different. I don't think they're coming in like the haddock and eating the eggs afterwards. I think they come in and try and they'll have the spawning herring either when they're spawning and they'll rip their bellies out and stuff like that. But that's been historically that's been a thing, the connection between spur dog and herring. So I've previously done some historical work in the herring drift net fisheries in the North Sea in the 1930s. Well, even prior to that, prior to sort of steam, there was it was a big problem. You hand hauled in a drift net, and it was full of spur dogs that were captured, that were caught in the net. But they were there, of course, because they were there for the herring, the spur dogs. And at that time, the government put a bounty on spur dog. So they put on a shilling a nose for a spur dog because it was basically culling. It was a problem for the production of the herring fishery, and the solution was to kill the predators, just do predator control. So they put a bounty of a shilling a nose on them.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Yeah, wow, a shilling a nose.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, as far as, well, probably predator prey, I remember when I was younger and my father was a fisherman, we'd be driving up the coast. We were from a small fishing village, Helmsdale, on the east coast. And just say we were driving up and down the coast from maybe the Lake of Wick or that. We would certainly see, it would appear to be in circles, and we would see birds, and you could obviously tell it was gulls, and they were feeding, and broads they were called. And obviously it was my father era. There was none of the technology they have now, so it would be signs and signals that would go by like that. And what just maybe it was coming to April, that sort of time of the year, if he would see that as we're looking out the coast, he would say that was a great sign, and they would be thinking, if we're seeing that now, come the summer we'll get haddock in the
Ah,
it would be
yeah.
a good sign for them.
Like you say, when you don't have the technology, you've got to follow the telltales that are out there. I think the birds are always. It's strange. You see fishermen still use birds all the time, even with the high tech, because the visibility, it just seems so good. And so it's that thing that catches your eye in the distance or something. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, People often say humans are just another predator. Scientifically, is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, it's like I said earlier, scientifically, at least in a stock assessment, they're just another letter or a part of the equation. You've got predation is Z equals F plus M. So Z is total death. The humans part is the F, and the M part is everything else that that either eats them or they die. So yeah, it's humans are just another predator from a sort of a scientific stock assessment point of view.
Okay, yeah. And multi-species and ecosystem models are often presented as a solution. How close are they to being genuinely or useful for management?
Depends who you ask. Yeah, ask the people who've been doing it for 30 years. They say they've been ready for 20 or 30 years. Um, I've been involved actually in both areas of this, and 10 years ago, um, I would have, when I was really actively doing a lot of ecosystem modeling work, I would have said we're ready, and I think there was a number of forays into that arena where ecosystem models were being used to either not sense check, I say provide additional complementary advice or evaluation of the consequences of things like fisheries advice setting. So if you set an advice for a TAC on a herring of a number, what's the consequences of removing that for all the things that are dependent on herring? So that's probably the strongest context of which they're likely to get used. So it's the collateral impacts assessment kind of side. The belief was that you could actually run multi-species assessment models, and there is one for the North Sea that takes account of all of the food web, all of the interactions, and then tries to advise on the state of the stocks, and maybe then say state of fisheries for all the things. But the reality is, there are so many moving parts to that, right? We're not that great at doing it with single species models. And it just adds to such a huge additional layer of complexity, and that the uncertainties become even bigger. So potentially the volatility of the assessments uh, become worse. So while I would have originally been a big advocate of that because I was involved and understood it, I think the pragmatism and the practicalities of the system that we have for doing assessments and delivering advice really don't make that possible at this time. So it's really the impact assessment side of it. So I think there's a much closer marriage to be made between ecosystem modeling and assessments and advice, but it's really on the consequences. And the closest I've come to see that, so if anyone's interested, is there's um there's been a series of workshops called WK by ICES called WK Irish, and they really started to think about what that means about using ecosystem models, taking new and additional information and trying to build it into what advice would you give for fisheries. So that's the best example I've seen, but that's been sitting now. So it came out a few years ago, and I would say the uptake hasn't been what people were hoping for at the time. But it's pretty sophisticated stuff going on around the world, so,
Uh-huh.
maybe we'll get there.
Yeah, I'm sure. Why do pelagic species attract such simplified and polarized narratives compared with other fisheries?
Um, I think there's different aspects to that. Um, my first thought is really that's about volume, tonnage, scale of the fisheries. I mean, it's a stark eye opener when you see the scale of the numbers that are removed from from of pelagic fish from ecosystems. Because it looks like a lot, and it is a lot, but there's a lot of fish there because they're so pivotal in the food web, capitalizing on the production from the plankton. It generates a lot of production, so I think that's why it attracts attention. So volume, value. I mean, we see obviously now with things like mackerel that it's attracting a lot of attention. That's because it's become highly valuable and then highly contentious with the states that and the fisheries that are part of that. So they have a big stake. And the other dimension is probably from the more environmental side is their role we've just talked about in the food web. So they attract attention because they are a pivotal connector in the food web. So they're worthy of that attention.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. If pelagic management gets predator-prey dynamics wrong, what's the biggest risk? Ecological imbalance, poor advice, or bad policy?
Oh. God, how long did it take to do these questions, Jim? Because they're tough ones.
Oh
Yeah.
dear.
Yeah.
When you when you say that, when you've been saying to me, that's a good question, I don't know whether I should say, oh, that's good, or should I apologize?
Right. Okay. Um, biggest risk. What are the three things again?
Ecological imbalance, poor advice, or bad policy?
All of them. Okay. So I think let's start ecological imbalance. Biggest risk, ecological imbalance. Yeah, but may so I think there's a risk for all three, but the consequences are different, partly because of the timescales. So if you look at ecological imbalance, of course, there's a risk. We've talked about food webs, but I don't think it's not an immediate risk, right? Because food webs, like fish can eat other fish, they don't just go hungry and die. They'll eat something else. There's loads of buffering. So the ecosystem, the food web, and the full thing moves slowly, reacts slowly, responds slowly. There's lots of buffering in the system. So I think there is a risk of change, but it's not immediate consequences, in a sort of a risk analysis. Poor advice, I think that's the most immediate risk. You get something wrong, you can underestimate or overestimate either the productivity or sensitivity of a species because of its linkages to predator-prey, and the consequences come straight at you next year or the next time the assessments run. Um, Bad policy, I guess there's two aspects to policy there. There's or strategy. There's how science develops to take into account these kind of interactions, and then you've got policies that favor potentially some species over another, either because of their economic value, their conservation significance, or conservation risk, um, and their profile. We see a lot. I'll give you an example here. At the moment, we've talked about birds. The birds have a really high profile in conservation arena, and we've seen in conversations about wind farms that potential impacts of wind farms on birds have become so high and so charged in those conversations that they're talking about the solution to protect the birds from all the killing from all the turbines is to stop the fisheries. So the risks then, I'd say that's bad policy because you're offsetting the the impacts by one industry caused um, uh, on birds to another industry, the fishing industry, that isn't responsible for that thing. But that's the kind of conversations I had because of the, the predator. They're invoking predator prey dynamics, but birds are being rated or seen as more important than fish.
Maybe another answer to that is I remember being at the Marine Lab in it's either Tory Research or the Marine Lab at a meeting, and they were going on about how accurate the figures could be, stocks and that. And when they were challenged about it, it was quite a variance. It could be 40% out. And their point was, and I was just wondering if it's relevant there today, it's not an exact science, as they said.
Yeah. I don't think any. I'm not sure which bits of science are exact. It's certainly not marine science. That's one thing I've learned. Uncertainty is certain, and that's about as good as it gets.
That's good. Eh, Another one that you have mentioned already, which I think would be interesting to hear your view on. The big boat, small boat. Big is seen as bad and small is seen as good. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm a scientist working in the pelagic industry, so um, I, I'm aware of the kind of the optics sometimes that people have, and I think it's misguided, and maybe because the biggest what's the word fallacies, misunderstanding. That's the word. The biggest misunderstanding sometimes is that big boats, with all their catching power and potential, are basically not regulated. I think so many people don't understand how fisheries work. They just go big boat hoovering up the sea, and that's not the case. Big boats, whether they're pelagic boats or whitefish boats, whether they're Dutch boats, Scottish boats, any other boats, they're super highly regulated to be fishing and monitored against their total allowable catches. So they have an amount that they're allowed to catch, and then if they catch over and above that, they're penalised and that. So their reporting and monitoring is highly regulated. They are not unrestricted, um, and they also invest heavily, in and infrastructure and supply chains and things of big boats. Um, bring in a lot into communities and markets. So that's one thing. So employment's good. Small boats, on the other hand, have just I suppose big boats as much as small boats are key both in the culture and flexibility. But even small boats, they may not have the sort of immediate, catching power, and some people would say impacts as big boats. But the regulations aren't the same either. So certainly for small scale boats, the inshore fishery areas determine catching and monitoring rules and things. So it's not that simple. Big boats, small boats, they all have a role to play, and I would say the fishing industry as a whole, when taken together, recognize that, and they coexist in a way that you know it's different horses for different courses.
Yeah, one of the things that I used to often, when I, I would have to say, I don't know if you agree, Steve, but I would have to say that most of the people who had that view, big boats are bad, small boats are good, are basically, I don't want to make it sound as if I'm having a go at people, but basically people that didn't know or understand the industry. And I could, as I said, my background is more whitefish. But I remember when there was a lot of big inshore fishery, and that was more, just say wooden boats from 50 to 65 feet. And they would be generally along the coast. And then as they got bigger, yes, maybe as they got bigger, they were catching more. But what I always used to feel was a distinction. The bigger boat could fish where the smaller boats were fishing inshore. But depending on where the stocks were there, well, then the bigger boat could move and go to other areas and give areas a chance rather than catch more.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So the progressive development of fisheries offshore as boats got bigger and more capable, it kind of it managed to lay fallow some of the inshore areas because years ago that was the problem, the depletion of inshore areas. Uh, It's a tricky one, but we all watch social media to some degree, and it really does wind me up when I see the big boat thing just painted the picture that it's some unregulated hoovering up, and they just obviously people tell their story to the impact that they want to have, but it's disingenuous and it's not right.
Here's another one coming that you're probably going to say, where do you get your questions from? Probably the impossible dream. Looking ahead 10 years, what would success actually look like for a pelagic fisheries scientist or science?
Is this the bit where you offer me the money to do it, Jim? No. No, this
Yeah,
is
show me the money.
yeah, show me the money. Looking at what would success look like for pelagic fisheries? Well, let's start with the obvious, right? Um, Businesses are supported and thriving, and that in its own means that we have sustainability. So we have some long-term thing where people are, um, it's working, and you can plan for the future, and that means the stocks are there to support it. Um, Trusted assessments. I'd love to see the bridge or the gap between science or the trust gap rather than knowledge gap uh, improved. That maybe they go hand in hand, if you like. The knowledge gaps are closed and assessments are trusted, and they're doing their job. Um, Maybe, and if that came about, I think we'd all be better off, scientists included, if we got to that stage where we could have multi-annual TAC, so we don't have to do a catch quota assessment and prediction every year. If it was working well and you had a good handle on it, you can say, okay, we can just let this run, for 2 or 3 years, and then we'll come back to the assessment, and that alone would free up so much time, which is really precious for the scientific community because it's underfunded and over demanded, should we say? And that would free up so much time from some really high quality people to actually engage in closing those knowledge gaps in the first place. If we didn't spend all the time turning the assessment handle, so uh, yeah, there's a huge amount of resource goes into assessment, and if we got to a place where we didn't have to do it every year, we'd be in a better place there.
You'll know this certainly better than me, but I remember when I was more active in the fishing industry and traveling a lot. I don't know if it's the case now, but when you mention their multi years, Iceland were making come in with figures like that, and it was for 10 years.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but 10 years, 10 years seems a bit of a stretch, but yeah, I wouldn't go as far as 10 years, I think.
It certainly made us feel that it was certainly giving fishermen a chance to plan and invest their, know where their.
Yeah, yeah, which is key for everyone, really.
Yeah, definitely. Well, maybe just thank you and fold it up. And thank you, Steve. That was really good.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, I'm exhausted. You've drained my brain.